Hello, everyone. On today's podcast, I'm going to talk about atheism and how God works in mysterious ways. You know, atheists spend most of their lives, many atheists spend their lives trying to prove that God doesn't exist, right? But they have no idea that how God works. My entire podcast, if you've listened to my podcast before, right? The whole podcast is me explaining, the existence of God with, undeniable proof, right? Well, close to undeniable proof. Anyone can deny anything they want to deny. When it comes to life, no matter how great the proof you bring, there are people who will never listen to you. They will deny it without listening, without even reading a single word or listening to a single word you say. They will ignore everything you say and, just deny it. And that's life. There are people who will listen to you and there are people who won't listen to you. It is the duality of life. There are people who understand what you're trying to say, and there'll be people who will never listen to you to begin with. So how can they understand what you're trying to say? This is how life works. But when your pastor tells you God works in mysterious ways, you think they're lying, right? They're not. When an atheist opens their mouth, right, and try to convert someone to atheism, they don't even realize what they're doing, but they're actually inadvertently converting people into theism by default. They're converting people into Christians without them realizing it. And that's how God works. And here's a little proof for you for what I'm trying to say. The very word atheism, right? The very word itself is contradictory. Atheists never know. Many atheists never know that word is contradictory in and of itself. It's a contradictory it's a duality contradictory. So many people think the word atheism, means someone who doesn't believe in God, right? The definition of atheism is someone who doesn't believe in God, right? Then and a theist is someone who believes in God. You understand? So atheist is someone who doesn't believe in God, and a theist is someone who believes in God. Don't you see how contradictory the name of that, the very name, the very identity is? A theist is someone who doesn't believe in God, right? And a theist is someone who believes in God, and an atheist is someone who doesn't believe in God. So let me rephrase it quickly again. An atheist is someone who doesn't believe in God, and a theist is someone who believes in God. You finally see the logical inconsistency there, right? The two polar opposites. The word a can either mean, a car. You can use it as a car, a house, a theist, right? A theist is someone who believes in God, and that very word is the starting word of atheist. So that word itself has two different polar meanings. So when an atheist opens their mouth and call themselves a theist, what do you think most people think? They don't think he's an atheist, someone who doesn't believe in God. They automatically jump to conclusions and think he's a theist, someone who believes in God. You don't find that mind blowing? That the very word they use is, goes against their very identity itself. When they open their mind and tell you I'm an atheist, the very word itself says I'm a theist. I'm someone who believes in God. The very word says I'm someone who believes in God. I am a theist. So that's one of the weird ways that that's one of the ways that God tricks atheists into converting people into theists. The other one is that being an atheist is actually very illogical. Do you know why? It is an illogical stance to make. Why? Because if you ask an atheist, prove that God doesn't exist. That's their very question. Just ask them. A wise atheist will just tell you the truth. The dumber ones, the ones who will never admit the truth, whatever The ones who will never admit the truth, no matter what, will mock and insult you. Will tell you, no, I don't want, you prove something to me. You tell me this, you prove that God exists to me. Prove to me that God exists. Don't ask me to prove to you that God doesn't exist. Prove to me that God exists. Most atheists, if not all atheists, some atheists are actually pretty kind. They don't mock you. They don't insult you. But if you find that one atheist, all he'll do is insult and mock you. Instead of proving anything, he'll mock God. He'll insult you. He'll insult everyone you know. He'll say everything you know. He'll insult the Bible. He'll call you a fool. He'll call you a retard. He'll call you a group thinker. He'll call you, circle jerker. He'll call you so many names that you just get tired of talking to him. This is who you need to avoid. But most atheists, right? If you ask them, prove to me that God doesn't exist, guess what? They'll tell you it is impossible to prove that God doesn't exist. And it is the truth. It is logically and physically impossible in this very world to prove that God doesn't exist. You think I'm lying to you, but go ask them. Go ask these very atheists themselves. If you don't find them online, you just ask Google. Is it possible to prove that God doesn't exist? It's logically impossible to prove that God doesn't exist. So think about it. If it is impossible, right, to prove that God doesn't exist, yet an atheist believes that God doesn't exist, doesn't that mean, to become an atheist, you don't need proof? There's no logical proof to becoming an atheist. If there's no logical proof to becoming an atheist, then being an atheist is an illogical stance. They're only atheists through faith alone and nothing else, because they're incapable of proving that God doesn't exist. You may think I'm lying to you, but it's the truth. No one is capable of proving that God doesn't exist. It's one of the weird things in this world. It's an anomaly. You can't physically or logically prove that God doesn't exist. It is impossible. And since you can't prove that God doesn't exist, why do you believe that God doesn't exist? If it's impossible for you to come to a conclusion, then why did you come to a conclusion anyways? What reason? If it's unreasonable to believe that God doesn't exist, what reason did you choose to believe that God doesn't exist? Can't you understand? Can't they understand? And can't you understand this? This automatically means that being an atheist is an illogical decision. No atheist becomes an atheist using logic. This is why every time they open their mouth and speak, use logic, it always contradicts them, because being an atheist is illogical by default. If it's impossible to prove a point, then why do you believe that point is real? If it's impossible to prove that something, if it's impossible to prove that something doesn't exist, then why do you believe that it doesn't exist? You see? So being an atheist is by default an illogical decision, because it is impossible to prove that God doesn't exist. Yet my entire podcast, if you listen to my podcast, it's me proving that God exists. So it's physically possible to prove that God exists. Think about it. If you got to this, podcast episode, you understand what I'm trying to say. If it's impossible to prove that God doesn't exist, yet it is possible to prove that He does exist, what do you think? Which option should you choose out of the two options that you're given? If one is, physically and logically impossible to prove, while the one is is easily proven, which one is the logical conclusion, and which one is the illogical conclusion? Atheists will talk all day about how being a theist is an illogical conclusion. Yet the very definition of atheism, contradicts them. It is impossible to prove that God doesn't exist. Since it's impossible, why do they believe that God doesn't exist? You understand? If it is impossible to understand something, then why do you believe it? That thing is real. So don't let atheists gaslight you into thinking that God doesn't exist, because they're incapable of proving it. They say they can't prove it. They will literally tell you they can't prove it. I'm not lying to you. The truthful ones will tell you they can't prove it. The untruthful ones, the ones who like to lie, some atheists, if you put them on the spot, instead of just telling the truth, they'll start mocking you instead. Like I said before, they'll gaslight you, they'll trick you, they'll start to insult you. They'll say you're the dumbest one. They say you're the one who's drawing an illogical conclusion. You're drawing an illogical conclusion, but the truth is, they just don't want to listen to you. They're so illogical, they're incapable of listening to your basic logic. It's because they're incapable of listening to basic logic is why they decided to be an atheist. Because becoming an atheist is an illogical choice by default. So if you argue with an illogical person like an atheist who became an atheist without realizing that the very definition of atheism contradicts them, not Christians. If it's impossible to prove that God doesn't exist, then it means you only believe that God doesn't exist through faith alone and nothing else. If it is impossible to believe it, it means you only believe that through faith alone. There's no evidence for your choice. You made that choice without any evidence whatsoever. That means you're the most illogical person there. If there's a theist and an atheist in the room, you're the most illogical one there, because a theist can prove all day that God exists, but you're incapable of proving it. No, not all theists. Some theists do not even know why they're theists to begin with. But a logical theist, someone who knows what they're doing, will be capable of proving that God exists. While an atheist, it is virtually impossible, physically and logically impossible. I'm not making this up. It is physically and logically impossible for an atheist to prove that God doesn't exist. Since it's impossible, why do they believe it? Why would you believe that God doesn't exist if it's impossible to prove that it doesn't exist? Understand? Why? And that's the problem with atheism. It's a conclusion that was made without any logical reasoning involved. Many atheists do not believe that God doesn't exist. I believe that God doesn't exist simply because they don't like God. They don't like, pastors who kill people. They watch the news, they read the news, they hear about pastors killing people, or they hear about, Christians stealing money, or they hear about, the Catholic Church doing bad things. They automatically say, okay, because of all these things, it means God doesn't exist. But that's not proof that God doesn't exist. All it proves is that there are bad people in this world. There are bad people who pretend to be Christians. There are bad people who pretend to be kind people. That's all it proves. If a Christian does something bad, does not mean, God doesn't exist. It just means there are good Christians, there are bad Christians. And that's how this world works. There are good people and there are bad people in this world. Whether you're Christian or not, there'll be good people and bad people. There's so many Christians who go to church and kill the pastors for no reason, and kill the fellow, churchgoers for no reason. So it doesn't automatically mean that God doesn't exist. It's in the Bible itself. There'll be good Christians, there'll be bad Christians. That's why, Jesus says only a few people will enter the kingdom of heaven. So we already know there'll be bad people in this world. We already know there are bad people in this world. That's not proof that God doesn't exist. It's only proof that there are bad people in this world. And that's all an atheist is capable of telling you, that there are bad people in this world. They cannot truly prove that, that God doesn't exist. They can only insult you and trick you into thinking that God doesn't exist. That's the only thing that atheist is capable of doing, is tricking you into believing that God doesn't exist, because they're incapable of proving it. They didn't become an atheist because they can prove that God doesn't exist. They became an atheist knowing full well it is impossible to prove that God doesn't exist. It is impossible. So is that a logical conclusion? Choosing to believe that God doesn't exist, knowing full well that it's impossible, that it is impossible to believe that he doesn't exist. It is impossible to prove that he doesn't exist. So, think this through as a Christian, as a theist, do not let these atheists, trick you into thinking God doesn't exist, because they're incapable of proving it. It is logically impossible for them to prove it. Logically impossible. So the only thing they can do now, if they can't prove it, all they can do is ignore your proofs, your logical conclusions, and mock you. No matter how logical you are, you cannot convince an illogical person. That's what I said. At one of the earlier podcast episodes, I told you it's impossible to use logic to convince someone who came to an illogical conclusion. The only way to convince someone who came to an illogical conclusion is using an illogical argument. If an atheist became an atheist through an illogical, belief, through an illogical choice, through an illogical thinking pattern, it is virtually impossible for you to turn them into a theist using logic. Because if someone is illogical, that means logic doesn't work on them. And that's the problem with atheism, is that since they can't get, since they got to their point using, illogical thoughts, illogical thinking patterns, no matter what you say as a theist, they may never be able to understand what you're trying to tell them. They may never be able to come to the conclusion that God exists. You know why? Because they're illogical by default. No one can ever be an atheist using logic. It is virtually impossible to prove that God doesn't exist. Since it's impossible, the moment you believe that God doesn't exist, you're an illogical person by default. By default. I'm not the one that's jumping to conclusion. It is a basic fact. If you choose to believe something that's illogical, you are an illogical person. And choosing something illogical is choosing to believe that something doesn't exist when you have no proof of it. If you have no proof that something doesn't exist, you shouldn't believe that it doesn't exist. It's by default. So if you believe that God doesn't exist and there's no proof, it means you're an illogical person. I'm not lying to you. It's basic fact, basic logic. So interacting with someone who's illogical, what do you think will happen to you? All they'll do at the end of the day is mock and insult you. If they can't convince you using their flawed logic that always, backfires and proves them wrong every time, if they can't convince you, the only people they can convince with their flawed logic, are people who do not think logically. People who think logically cannot be convinced with their flawed logic, because they'll be able to realize that, the logic doesn't, back them up in any way, shape, or form. They are illogical people. The logic is illogical. The only people who can convince them, who will be convinced by them, are people who already, a celebrity can convince you to buy Bitcoin. If the people that will be able to be convinced by them are people who already revere them, people who think highly of them, and people who think highly of them are only converting to atheism just because they like them. So it's an illogical reason why they're converting to atheism. They're not converting to atheism because they actually believe that God doesn't exist. They're converting to atheism because, hey, I like you. You're a kind person. Some atheists are very, very kind. That alone is enough for some people to say, okay, although you make no logical sense, I will back you up and become an atheist just like you because you're a kind person. That's all. Or because you're a celebrity. If a random child, your teenager goes online and see the celebrity say, I'm an atheist, guess what? Your child will automatically want to be an atheist just like them, Just like when your child sees a celebrity wear, a shirt, they'll be begging you to buy that shirt for them, or a pair of sneakers. They'll be begging you to buy a pair of sneakers for them. That's the only reason someone will ever become an atheist, is because it's that group thinking mindset where I want to be like the celebrities that I see online. If a celebrity is gay, I'll be gay. If a celebrity is, is an atheist, I'll be an atheist. If a celebrity invests in Bitcoin, I want to invest in Bitcoin too. That's the only reason why someone will ever be an atheist. It's an illogical reason. So if you ever, encounter an atheist, just know that they're not atheists because they've thought things through and realized that, they found proof that God doesn't exist. No, it is impossible to prove that God doesn't exist. And since it is impossible, the only way they can convince you is through illogical arguments. There's only only illogical means, they only have illogical means left for them to convince you to be an atheist. One of them is through, group thinking. One of them is through their own, celebrity status. If they're a celebrity, they'll automatically convince you. Some of these scientists, are revered in their field. So if they just say that they're atheists, everyone, many other scientists who have no idea what atheism truly means, they have no idea that that very conclusion is extremely illogical. They don't think things through, enough. So they just convert to atheism without really realizing that being an atheist is the most illogical choice you can make. Because you can't prove it. You can't prove your belief. If you can't prove your belief, it's based on faith alone and nothing else. So you really, as a Christian, you really have to think things through. If you want to debate an illogical person like an atheist, you have to be very careful because they're not logical people to begin with. That means no matter how much you talk about logic to them, they're just incapable of understanding you. Because they didn't get to their point by logic. They didn't get to their point by logic. No matter how much logic you speak to an illogical person, it just won't work. It's just physically impossible. The only way you can trick an illogical person is using illogical means. You trick them by if their favorite celebrity is a theist, if they can find a good celebrity for them, and then use that person as a spokesperson, tell them to convert to theism again. Many of them will convert. That's how they got to where they are to begin with. They're followers. They followed the group of scientists that are atheists, and they became atheists as well. So if you can find a group of scientists that they revere just as much as the one that converted them to atheism, or a group of spokesperson that they revere that can convert them to theism, these guys would jump ship immediately because they didn't get to their point by logic. So they didn't get to their point by logic. It is very easy for you to convince them to, but you have to use illogical means. Using logic in front of an illogical person is childish. They will not understand a single word you say. They will use illogical answers, as replies to your logical questions or to your logical answers. You talk to an atheist, and all they bring to you is either mockery or insult. And if they can't convince you with mockery and insult, then it's fist fights, or they walk away. If they can convince you, by mocking religion, by insulting God, by insulting the Bible, by insulting anything they can insult, by treating you like you're garbage, like you're a fool. If they can't do that and convince you, there's nothing else they can do. That's all they're logically capable of doing. Because it's illogical to become an atheist. It is virtually impossible to prove that God doesn't exist. So that's it for today's podcast. I'll talk to you guys later.